Today at T-Mobile, I'm joined by a special co-anchor.
What up, everybody? It's your boy, Big Snoop Deal Double G.
Snoop, where can people go to find great deals?
Head to T-Mobile.com and get 4 iPhone 16s with Apple Intelligence on us, plus 4 lines for $25.
That's quite a deal, Snoop. And when you switch to T-Mobile, you can save versus the other big guys' comparable plans plus streaming.
Respect. We up out of here.
See how you can save on wireless and streaming versus the other big guys at T-Mobile.com/switch. Apple Intelligence requires iOS 18.1 or later.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. When your computer breaks, you don't wait for it to magically start working again. You fix the problem. So why wait to hire the people your company desperately needs? Use Indeed's sponsored jobs to hire top talent fast. And even better, you only pay for results. There's no need to wait. Speed up your hiring with a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
I can say to my new Samsung Galaxy S25 Ultra, hey, find a keto-friendly restaurant nearby and text it to Beth and Steve. And it does, without me lifting a finger. So I can get in more squats anywhere I can. 1, 2, 3.
Will that be cash or credit?
Credit. 4.
Galaxy S25 Ultra, the AI companion that does the heavy lifting so you can do you. Get yours at Samsung.com. Compatible with select apps. Requires Google Gemini account. Results may vary based on input. Check responses for accuracy.
The little lamb to the shepherd boy. Do you hear what I
really am a mean and despicable creature at heart, you know.
You may wish to adjust the dial. You're currently tuned into the wrong station. Every single day after work, Kieran would take the Line 2 subway home. And every single day he took the exact same train, the one whose first car was numbered 6689. Some days this meant waiting 56 minutes for the train to go all the way to the end of the line and return, just so he could ride it for another 40 minutes down to the opposite end and back to his starting point, and from there another 5 stops home. But he was fine with that. He was never tempted to take a different train. For much the same reason, a parent would wait any amount of time outside of school to pick up their own child, rather than just pick up another child at random. 6689 was his train, and the track of reciprocity ran both ways. Megan had once asked Kieran why train 6689 was so important to him. She had a nice office paneled with dark and reddish wood, particle board pretending to be cherry. She kept a couple of small magnetic trains on those classic wooden tracks on the bottom shelf of her coffee table, for children and for adults like Kieran. Whittle Shortline was the brand, and it was a very good brand. Kieran had several of his own at home. Megan's train cars were all Canadian. There was a CN GP38 engine, a Canada Wheat No. 2 cylinder hopper car, as well as a No. 4, a CN tanker car, high cube box car, and mechanical refrigerator car. There was also, incongruously, a daffodil yellow caboose from Canadian Pacific. Kieran didn't like the CP caboose with the CN engine and cars, but he did like the caboose on its own, so he didn't make a fuss. The toys were beautifully carved by Germans somewhere, and the magnets on their ends clicked together with the most satisfying imaginable click. He loved to just sit on the couch in Megan's office, running those trains smoothly over their gentle wooden tracks, while she talked to him in a soft voice. He liked Megan. Unlike most people, she was easy to be with. When she asked him about 6689, he took a long time to answer, because he wanted to do the question justice. She just sat with him and let him take his time. 6689 is a very good train, he said at last. You can tell by the vibration when you're sitting in it it's the most solid out of all the trains on Line 2. Its acceleration is very smooth. Its brakes are very good. Did you know it was the fourth one of the new trains to be rolled out? No, I didn't, Kieran. That's very interesting. But why is it significant? Because they knew what they were doing when they built it, but it was new enough that they still had to pay attention to everything. So every screw is tight, every single part of the train is just correct. Is it a beautiful train? He nodded, glad she'd asked. Very beautiful. Most other trains, even the new ones, have lots of rust on them. 6689 has very little rust. Is that how you always know when 6689 is coming down the tracks? She'd waited for the train with him before. He'd known 6689 was the approaching train when it was barely more than a set of lights down at the end of the tunnel. That, and the sound. It makes the most beautiful sound when it's coming down the tracks. Like it's singing. Would you say you love this train? That question snagged him. No, that's stupid. It's just a train. But the words pained him to say. She said, gently, I don't think it's stupid at all. There's a marsh near where I grew up, which I love very much. I love it for its beauty, and for what it does, which is clean the rain, and for how well it does what it does, and for the sounds that rise from it at twilight. I don't think it's stupid for me to love the marsh, and I don't think our two things are so different. Well, he told her, trains are much better than marshes. One day, near Christmas, his boss called him with an annoying question when he was waiting on the platform and distracted him from the sound of his train until it had already pulled into the station. When he realized what was happening, he said, I have to go, and hung up on his boss. He lowered the phone, staring in horror. The train, which had just pulled into the station, was train 6689. The red numbers along the side of the driver's cab said 6689. But this train was not 6689. This train was an imposter. The doors chimed. Rush hour traffic flowed out of the car. Rush hour traffic flowed in. But Kieran just stood paralyzed in front of the open doors. The white light which poured out of the train was not quite right. It was too blue to be the light of 6689. The smell was not quite right. It smelled too much of people, while 6689 always smelled slightly more of plastic and the subtle lubricant of machines. It was only when the doors closed that he blinked and came back to himself. He shook his head, reached out to touch the stainless steel of the doors, and then recoiled. The touch of them was all wrong. It was like reaching for a partner's hand under the bedsheets at night and finding a hand that belonged to someone else. It was shocking, revolting. He stepped back until his JanSport knapsack was pressed into the cold tiles of the subway station walls. And then he watched in confusion as the train that was not 6689 disappeared down into the darkness of the tunnel. That evening, he waited hour after hour for his train to come. The imposter train went past a second time, and then a third. At last, a man from the station came and said he had to leave. It's 1:30, my friend. The last train already left. But my train never came. Sorry, friend, you have to take a cab. He walked home, alone in the cold and dark. When he got there, he curled up, fully clothed on his bed with the sheets around him and the lights out, whimpering until he fell asleep. The next day, he waited on the platform for 6689 to arrive. When he heard the familiar squeal of its brake in the darkness of the tunnel, his heart leaped. But as he turned, beaming toward the entrance of the station, the train burst forth from darkness, and he could tell by its grinning face that this was not his train. Imposter. He was so paralyzed by the horror and shock that he just stood there staring again as people flowed in and out. Then the bad train ripped out of the station and he came back to himself again. 96 minutes before it returned. He went upstairs and found a coffee shop and drank a 4-shot Americano. stared out the window, chewing on his lip and shaking his right leg. Then he went next door to the Home Hardware and, for half-formed reasons, bought himself a flathead screwdriver. Then he went back down to the platform to wait. Another 20 minutes, and the bad train came ripping into the station once more, grinning at him as it did. He tightened his jaw and waited. As soon as the doors opened, he leaped through, shouldering aside the other riders who were trying to climb off. The inside of that train was not like the inside of 6689. The air was the wrong color. The seats were a vivid, pulpy purple. None of the ads made any sense. He stood there in the middle of the car, dumbfounded as people shouldered past him. How could any of them not notice the uneven floors, the loose screws, the strange smell and tremor on the air? The train was humming, not like a machine, but like a person who's about to hurt you. He closed his eyes, feeling sick, and he could feel the train notice and take pleasure in his distress. But he forced himself to open his eyes, and he walked to the end of the train and sat down across from the driver's cabin and waited. The train pulled out. Instead of moving cleanly, straightly, it seemed to undulate in its movements, like an immense, smiling worm. He hated it, but he sat with clenched teeth and intense determination, and waited. He rode the train all the way west, and then back east over the Don until the robotic announcer said they'd be stopping for a crew change. It was early, the end of the overnight shift, so the driver was a youngish South Asian guy, low on the ranks of seniority. As he left the train, wiping the tired corners of his eyes, Kieran followed him at a distance up the stairs. Still early enough that the system was quiet. Kieran waited until the driver was halfway up the empty staircase before he shouted after him, Hey, excuse me." The driver turned, wearing that slightly threatened expression a person gets when someone starts shouting after them on public transit. Can I help you?" "Hey, sorry." Kieran stopped a couple steps below him. "What happened to the train?" "Train?" "Yes, train 6689. What happened to it? It was different today and yesterday." The driver's eyes flicked up the stairs, down to the platform, checking to see if anyone was around in case Kieran tried to stab him. "I didn't notice anything. The train was completely different." Okay. "It wasn't the same train as before. What happened to the train from before?" The driver stared at Kieran for a moment, then seemed to make up his mind about him. "Look, bro, I don't know what to tell you. It's the same train." "Are you completely sure about that? Do you have any evidence to suggest you were in the same train today as you were on previous trips? How would you know if it was a different train?" At this, the driver laughed and threw up his hands. "You got me, bro. Philosophy. I guess I don't really know. Happy?" Kieran was not happy. It was clear the driver was totally ignorant about trains, which was disappointing, if not totally surprising. "I'm not happy," said Kieran. "Okay, well, sorry. Have a good day, man." He began to climb up the stairs. "Wait!" Maybe there was something useful even the driver, in his ignorance, could give him. "Where would you send a broken train?" The driver half turned. "I don't know. Greenwood Station? Kiel if it was really fucked up and you just needed to keep it somewhere for a while before you scrapped it." Kiel. "Yeah, man. Visit ttc.ca to find out more." With that final shot over his shoulder, he climbed the rest of the stairs, leaving Kieran lost in thought at the bottom. He spent the rest of the day scouting. He had many missed calls from work. He became convinced that Kiel Yard was an insane name for the rail repair yard, because it was actually closer to Dundas West Station than it was to Kiel. This mattered, because the world was filled with a dizzying number of inconsistencies, of concessions to inaccuracy. And it was wrong. It led to manifold evils, and it made people like him, people who could see and notice the things that were wrong, people who couldn't just let that wrongness wash over them. It made them look crazy when they were the only reasonable ones. The next day broke rainy and incredibly dark. He waited by Dundas West Station all afternoon. Near the end of work hours, he got a phone call from Megan. For once, that day, he didn't screen the call. Kieran? Her voice on the other end made him feel safe, as it often did. You didn't show up to our session today. I was just worried, so I wanted to check in. Are you all right? Yes. Sorry. I just got busy with work. I'm fine. A truck went past, loud enough that she could hear it on the other end of the line. Are you out right now? Yes. Just going for a walk in High Park. Oh? That's a bit of a ways from your place. Yes, it is. Anyway, thank you for calling. I'm fine. I will see you next week. Okay, Kieran, you know if there's anything going on, you can talk to me. Yes. Thank you, Megan. Yes, I know that. Okay. I'll see you next week. Goodbye. He hung up. There was a way into the Kiel Yard through Dundas West Station, but there were people and cameras in there. Instead, he thought he'd found a better way in, over the concrete revetment and the fence on Edna Avenue, where there were trees he could climb up and get past the barbed wire overhang. He already had a length of yellow plastic rope in his bag from the hardware store. It had been a dark, snowy day, and as the day faded, the orange street lights were already coming on. He thought it should be quiet enough by 7, so he walked several laps around the block to kill time. The neighborhoods glowed with green and red and golden Christmas lights. At last, the remnants of rush hour traffic faded, and he thought the side streets were empty enough that he could move without being seen. He came back around onto Edna and looked up at the chain-link fence. The rail yard above was long and narrow, with room for 4 trains. There was currently only one that he could see, gently rusting in the rain with the lights out. But at the Dundas end of the rail yard, he knew that 4 entrances yawned in the earth, black, with corners rounded off. Exactly the sort of place he'd put a train to forget about it. He looked down the street, trying to plan his ascent. From where he stood, the climb was about 20 feet of rain-slicked concrete, followed by 10 or so of chain-link fence, and then a drop onto pebbled gravel on the other side. He found a likely tree, a great old honey locust with a few yellow leaves still clinging to the tips of its snowy boughs, and sized it up. The bark was shining damp and black from the wet snow, but there were some good low limbs, and one solid bough crooked out above the rail yard fence. He thought it would probably support his weight against the gray glowing sky. But only barely. If the limb broke before he got across the fence, he would fall more than 30 feet and be severely injured. But he decided the risk was justified, and he began to climb. It was hard to keep his fingers from slipping on the wet wood, and most of the boughs were covered in more than an inch of packing snow. But his process was painstaking. He held on tightly to the trunk, even when the rough bark made his hands begin to bleed. Any time he had to make a dangerous move, he would tie himself to the trunk or to a solid bough first, and then untie himself afterward. One time he lost his grip and fell a few inches before the rope caught him, digging painfully up onto his armpits and scraping his face against the bark. But the knots held. He was good with knots. He understood which ones applied to which situations. And finally, with his arms like lead and the cuts on his hands and face smarting with the cold wind, he crept out over that groaning bough above the chain-link fence. The wet snow soaked through small rips in the front of his jacket, soaking him to the skin. He tied his rope to the bough and slowly tried to let himself down. The bough broke, and he fell. One moment, he was staring at the amber lights above the houses on Etna. The next, the world was upside down, and he was in the wet, snowy gravel staring up at the sky, and his head was pounding, and he couldn't breathe, and there was a sharp, sickening pain running through one ankle. He started to panic. He would have cried if he'd been able to draw breath. Fat flakes of snow came down to melt on his face like tears as he struggled for breath. But eventually he caught his wind. He groaned and rolled over and used his raw hands to slowly push himself to his knees. His palms burned. He was in a lot of pain and really beginning to regret this situation he'd got himself into. The snow was falling a little more heavily by now. He straightened gingerly to his feet. When he tried to put weight on his left ankle, it sparked with a sudden pain. But he was in. He was in the yard, and he was sure, somehow, that this was the right place to be. It felt as though 6689 would be here, and the more he thought about that feeling, the more he realized why it made sense. With a shiver, he understood that this was the sort of place a more depraved version of himself would have taken the train away to. He glanced up and down the fence, checking for cameras, and when he spotted one over the far wall, he put himself out of its line of sight in the shadow of a train. Then, quietly as he could, he limped down through the gravel toward those 4 cavernous entrances at the Dundas end of the yard. The first of the 4 bays turned out to be empty, just a yawning void in the world. The second held a train, but it was one of the old snub-nosed T1 models from the turn of the millennium, slowly giving off flakes of rust in the darkness like autumn leaves. The third bay was empty, except for an old 1997 RT2 flat car. But in the fourth bay, illuminated gently from within, waited train number 6689. The sight of it was like a warm drink on a cold day. He shut his eyes and leaned against the damp concrete at the edge of the tunnel, and quietly gave thanks to whatever god of locomotives chugged along the tracks of human destiny. Then there came a muffled crash from inside the train, and his eyes snapped open as he realized 6689 was in danger. His train wasn't the only thing in that tunnel. As he crept out of the falling snow and into the clammy gloom, fumbling in his pocket for that flathead screwdriver, he kept stumbling over torn stuffed animals, and nice pieces of clothing all soiled and bunched up, and empty pet carriers, and old books with the guts torn out, and once, bizarrely, some large bones that looked like they belonged to a horse. His grip clenched tightly around the handle of the screwdriver, stinging in his palm. The lights inside 6689 flickered slightly at the sound of another horrid crunch from within, and Kieran flinched as if he'd just seen someone get their teeth pushed in. The first set of the train's doors were open. Quietly as he could, he placed his hands onto the edge of the inside of the train, and then tried to awkwardly raise his body up and inside without making any noise. Those crunching and crashing sounds were being made by a person. Someone was hurting 6689. He made it up somehow, despite his burning hands and aching shoulders. Inside the car, the lights were on, but dim, and he couldn't see all the way down as he limped along the aisle with one set of fingertips brushing from pole to pole, the other wrapped tightly around his screwdriver. Then, in the gloom ahead, he saw him. A man, pale and naked, half-hunched with his head stuffed inside a console in the train walls which he'd pried open with a crowbar. The sound got into Kieran's teeth like a dentist's drill, not just crunching, but slurping. For a moment, Kieran wanted to shrink and creep his way back down the length of the car without making a sound. But then, with another crunch and slurp, the pale man gave a little moan or moo of pleasure, and the sound so revolted and enraged Kieran that he squeezed the handle of the screwdriver until the hot pain of raw skin made him brave, and he straightened up and shouted, "Stop that right now!" The figure froze with its head buried in the console. Then it raised 2 hands to brace against the edges of the opening and slowly withdrew its head. And Kieran realized it wasn't a man at all. The fingers which grasped the edge of the console ended in fingernails like thick, black claws, and the head, when it withdrew, was shorter and much wider than a human head, with beady little forward-facing black eyes, and wide, muscular cheeks, and pale lips which housed a set of short, solid, conical black teeth. Said the creature, stepping forward into the beam of a dying fluorescent. In that light, its skin seemed faintly blue. Kieran felt the terror come over him like cold water, but he squared his feet, even with his broken ankle, crying out, and raised his screwdriver at the creature. "What are you doing?" It tilted its head at him.
"Eating."
"How can you eat a train?" The creature smiled.
"It's loved, isn't it? Anything that's loved, you can eat it."
Kieran faltered, taking a step back. The creature's smile widened much farther than a human smile could have.
"And what about you?"
it asked him.
"Are you loved? Could I replace you and take you somewhere to eat in the dark?"
At this, Kieran felt a sudden surge of confidence. "No," he said, with utter certainty. "No one loves me." But the creature studied at him for a long moment, its black eyes adjusting like camera shutters. Then the smile widened past the edges of its cheeks.
"Not true,"
it said, and descended on him. "Kieran? Kieran, are you here?" A voice in the darkness, then someone else. "Look, there are train lights on in the 4th bay. That's the one. Look, it's 6689. That's the one. Kieran, are you here?" Flashlight beams strobed the darkness of the tunnel, and a few sets of footsteps crunched down the darkness. The train swayed as somebody climbed aboard, and then again as that person helped a second person up. "Jesus, is that blood? Where does it lead? Blood?" A third voice. "Kieran? Look, down there. Oh, God, Kieran, call an ambulance." A radio crackled. The third voice muttered something low and urgent, and more voices crackled back at him in the gravel outside the train. Inside 6689, a woman and her husband knelt beside the body, desperately trying to staunch the bleeding. "Kieran, stay with us, okay? Stay with us." He woke in the hospital 2 days later to find his hands bandaged and his neck in a brace, with layers of thick gauze pleated over his chest. Megan's husband Eric was snoring in a battered old pleather chair in the corner of the room. Kieran's phone was on the bedside table, and as he reached for it, painfully, the door opened, and Megan came in carrying 2 cups of awful tea from the hospital cafeteria. "Kieran, you're awake." "Yes, I am awake." It was painful to speak. His throat hurt like he'd been terribly sick. Megan gently put down a cup of tea next to her snoring husband and came to sit beside the hospital bed. She was wearing a Christmas sweater with little blinking lights. "I feel very bad. Who found me?" "We did. Me and Eric and a man from the subway." "How did you know where I was?" She gave him a look that he couldn't quite read, a sort of smiling frown. "Well, I already thought something was up before we spoke on the phone, and when you said High Park, it felt off to me. You've never talked about liking the outdoors before." "I don't." "Well, exactly. So I started Googling what was around High Park, and I couldn't find anything that felt like it would have brought you to the area. But then I looked on maps and saw the Kiel subway station rail yard was just a few blocks away. And I just knew that's where you'd gone." He blinked. "I can't be that predictable." She smiled, straightforwardly this time. "Only to the people who know you. You were really hurt by the time we got there. Was it a dog? They gave you a rabies shot. The subway guy said they sometimes get coyotes from High Park, too." Kieran hesitated for a moment before answering. "I don't think it was a coyote. Dog owners in this city, out of control. You could have been killed. Someone else will get hurt before it gets caught, too, I'm sure." "I am sure they already have," said Kieran. "God, I hope not." Megan looked out the window at Bathurst Street. It was gray this time of year, except for the lighted windows. Then she sniffed and shuffled her chair forward and leaned in. "Listen, Kieran, the subway people have told me they're not going to get you charged with trespassing, as long as you promise you'll never do anything like that again. Can you make that promise, Kieran?" Can you promise me?" He looked at her for a long time. He could tell the question was very important to her, but he wasn't altogether certain why. He didn't know if he'd saved 6689 or not. There would be some reason why it wouldn't be saved, why they would find train 6689 at the yard, but not do anything about the false, evil 6689 that was creeping around the tracks. People always had some reason for being stupid that he couldn't understand, and they hated him for not understanding. He began to cry a little. Megan put out a hand toward him, and he took it. "All right," he said. "All right. I'll promise you." His wounds healed slowly, but they healed. He didn't lose his job when it turned out he'd been mauled by a dog, and that was why, so far as his boss knew, he had missed so many days of work. When he went back to the office, his coworkers had baked him a cake and signed a card for him, and were treating him nicely, even though they'd often ignored him before. It made him uncomfortable, because it made him feel the niceness wasn't really real. But it was still niceness, and that was something. And as time went on, he felt that at least some of the niceness lingered afterward. He stopped taking sessions with Megan after that, and started taking them with Dr. Eisner instead, who insisted that Kieran call him Jimmy, which Kieran said he would take under consideration. But that was because he was now sort of friends with Megan and Eric, and they invited him for dinner once a week, and asked him about his life, and told him about theirs. And that was nice. Actually nice, on purpose. And he still rode the subway home from work each day, but now he boarded the first train that came, just like everybody else. He never saw 6689, the real one, or the fake one, ever again. And that was fine. He was fine. He was just like everybody else. Something had gone out of Kieran's life forever. But he decided that it wasn't reasonable to let that break him apart. He had Megan and Eric to look after now, and he knew he couldn't do a good job of looking after them if he was always dwelling on the past. You have to cherish the things you love, he decided. Because you never know when something will take them away. The Wrong Station is made possible with the generous support of our listeners on Patreon. Visit today at patreon.com/thewrongstation. You can also support us by leaving a rating and review on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever it is you tune into the show. This week's episode, Wrong Train, was written by Alexander Saxton and performed by Anthony Botello. Thank you to Jade Lunaire, Beth Bronwyn, Charles Basner, Miss Indigo J.S. Renard, Lance Beaudreau, Thomas Duck, and a very special thanks to Jimmy Eisner for helping us keep the lights, well, off. The Wrong Station is co-produced by Alexander Saxton, Anthony Botello, and Jacob Duarte Spiel, with music composed and performed by Alon Citron and arranged for the viola and performed by Viola Schmidt. You can follow The Wrong Station on social media at The Wrong Station and email us at thewrongstation@gmail.com. And until next time, thank you for listening.